Hayes only shook her head, her expression hardening. This is bigger than we thought, and we're just getting started. The final twist hit. The man who had been dragging the child, who had seemed like the villain, wasn't a random abductor at all. He was part of a much larger operation, and now they had only scratched the surface. The true masterminds were still out there, and the child's words had opened a door they might not be ready to walk through. As the dust settled, the officer watched the child being carefully placed into an ambulance. His small body was bruised, but alive. The shot had been close, but the quick response from the backup team had saved him. The man who had been driving him away was arrested, but the bigger questions remained. Detective Hayes turned to the officer, her eyes focused. "We've got leads, but the organization behind this is deep," she said. "We're going to need everything we've got to take them down." With the child now safe and the immediate danger past, the officer couldn't shake the weight of the situation. The case was far from over, but they had made a critical breakthrough. The missing brother, the twisted network, and the child's brave words were the first clues in a much larger puzzle. As the sirens faded into the distance, one thing was clear: the fight for justice was only just beginning. In that moment, everything hung in the balance. Would they make it out alive? Would the child be safe? The answers were moments away, but for now, they remained just out of reach. The tension in the alley was suffocating. The officer's hand tightened around his radio, unsure whether to call for backup or make a move. The man stood there, the gun still pointed at the ground, but ready to raise it at a moment's notice. The child's wide eyes flickered between the officer and the man, as though searching for a way out. The officer's mind raced, but his body remained still, calculating every possibility. Just as the officer took a step forward, a sharp sound echoed through the alley, a car door slamming shut. The officer's head snapped toward the noise, and in that split second, the man lunged. Everything happened in a blur. The gun was up, the officer was already moving, but it wasn't fast enough. A shot rang out, shattering the quiet of the night. But the officer wasn't the one who fell. The child, now clutching his side, crumpled to the ground. The officer's stomach dropped. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. What had just happened? Had the man shot the child, or was it someone else? And if so, where had they come from? As the officer rushed to the child's side, a voice from the shadows echoed. "You should have backed off when you had the chance." Detective Hayes, just arriving on the scene, froze. The alley had become a war zone, and the stakes had just escalated beyond anything she had imagined. She couldn't see who had spoken, but she knew this wasn't just a random incident. Someone else was pulling the strings. And now, the officer and the child were caught in the middle of something much larger. What was the real story here? Why was the child caught in the crossfire? The questions were piling up fast, and time was running out. The officer's heart pounded in his chest as he knelt beside the child, his hand pressed tightly to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. He wasn't sure how much time they had before the situation spiraled completely out of control. The sound of sirens grew louder, and Detective Hayes appeared in the alley, scanning the scene with a sharp eye. But before she could make a move, the man who had been holding the gun spoke again. "You should have stayed away," the man hissed, his eyes wide and frantic. "You don't understand. None of you do." The officer's gaze hardened, trying to make sense of what was happening. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "What's going on here?" The man hesitated, as if weighing whether to say more, but before he could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. Suddenly, a group of masked figures appeared from the shadows, weapons in hand. The officer's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about a kid and an abductor, it was something far bigger. The man, now outnumbered, seemed to shrink under the pressure. But just as the masked figures closed in, something unexpected happened. The child, who had been gasping for breath, suddenly reached out with trembling hands, his small voice barely a whisper. "I know where they're keeping him." Everyone froze. The officer's eyes widened in disbelief. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice urgent. The child, despite the pain, looked directly at the officer. "They took my brother. They said they'd kill him if I told anyone. But I'm telling you now." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The officer had thought this was just a case of a frightened child and a desperate man, but this was something else entirely. The child wasn't just a victim. He was a key witness to something much darker. As the realization sunk in, Detective Hayes took a step forward, her voice cold and controlled. "We need to get him out of here," she said. "Now." The masked figures had surrounded them, their leader smirking as he aimed a gun at the officer. But just as he pulled the trigger, a shot rang out from an unexpected direction. The leader staggered, his gun dropping to the ground. A second shot followed, and the rest of the masked figures froze. From behind the corner, another officer appeared, someone who had been tracking the operation from the shadows. They had been watching this whole time. "You're not getting away with this," the officer shouted. In the chaos, the group of masked figures scattered. The officer knew they weren't done yet. As the child was whisked away for medical treatment, the officer turned to Hayes, his face grim. "We have no idea who's behind this, do we?" he asked.